And then the key thing at the end here is resilience. A big part of that, and a big way of looking at that, is thinking about what do you have control over and what do you not have control over. And that is really fundamental to resilience at a personal level and at a group level. And that's how we're going to start this session, is looking at this idea of control, and whether or not within groups we have more control or less control than as individuals from the perspective of resilience. So to look at that, I want to talk briefly about complicated and complex systems and problems. And this is a frame that I find really helpful to think about resilience. And I'm going to explain it a little bit. If you've come across this before, great. And if you can explain it better than I do, then please do pop that in the chat. But at a very simple level, complicated systems represented by this bicycle here. So a bicycle is a good example of a complicated system, in that it's not a simple system, but it is understandable. So you know how it works, but maybe you need a bit more expertise to really be able to, take it apart, put it back together again. But it's a closed system. So bike is something where you can see it. It doesn't need anything extra from the outside. It's a built system. So people have put it together. It's been constructed. It's predictable. Again, if you know how bikes work, you can predict what problems are going to arise, what's going to make it last longer, and it requires specific expertise or tools to really understand. On the right hand side, the alternative to this is that, think about a cyclist or a group of cyclists or traffic, and whether that's bicycles or cars or whatever feels resonant to you. Once we get to this level, the complicated system becomes a complex one. So it's not fully understandable. When you're out on a bike, in a car, whatever it is that you're doing, you can't fully understand what is going on, those wider perspectives, because it's an open system. You don't have control over all of that and what all of the different parts that make that work. It's predictable to a sense, but not wholly predictable. You cannot understand every single part of that system, because it's not built. It is grown, it's organic, and it changes over time. And a key thing here is that whereas a complicated system requires expertise and tools, a complex system requires perspectives or testing. You can't get it exactly right first time. You need to try things out, and you need to potentially make mistakes. You need people with different viewpoints to really understand how that system works. So the reason I'm talking about this is because this frame, this way of looking at things, is a really useful way of thinking about where control sits within your group, whether it's a community group, an organization, or whatever that might be. But control, and how much control you have over what's going on, is really important. Thinking about whether something is a complicated system or a complex system really changes how much control we have over this. So there's a couple of questions here that I'm going to quickly put you back into your breakout rooms, and I want you to consider these questions and discuss them amongst yourselves, and then we'll come back, and if anybody wants to share what they've been talking about, that's really useful. But thinking about within groups, so what are the barriers to resilience? And I'm going to keep this really, really broad, because there's so many different ways you can talk about this and think about this. But whether you want to talk about a group that you're a part of, or whatever it is that feels relevant to you, what are some of those barriers? And then think about, and this might be a conversation with the rest of your group, are these complicated or complex challenges? And if it doesn't seem obvious, that's fine. It might not be obvious. And if you've not come across these terms before, it might seem a little bit hard to really get your head around it. And that's fine. There's not a right or wrong answer. But I'd just like you to play around with those ideas. What I'll do is I'll just put you into the breakout rooms one more time, and invite you to have a conversation about that. But really start thinking about what are the challenges that you want to bring to this workshop? What are some of the examples? And I'm going to give you 10 minutes in your groups to look at this. So make sure that everybody gets a chance to talk, and then we'll come back and really get into what that actually means and what we can do with that information and that insight. So if anybody's got any questions, you can call me into your breakout rooms if you want to discuss it further. But really take this as an opportunity to explore without necessarily having to understand the answers, thinking about the barriers. And the reason we do that is because complicated systems are easier to control. There's an answer, there's a right and a wrong there. You can take it apart, you can put it back together again. It's a lot more reassuring for us to think of things as complicated. And sometimes that can be beneficial. It can bring us together, but generally it can make it really difficult because we end up underestimating how complex a situation is. And there's a lot of research out there that talks about this idea of treating complex situations as complicated as a failure of leadership. And it really can be a huge barrier to resilience in groups. And it doesn't mean that we have to have all of the answers, because one of the things about thinking about complex systems is we accept that we don't have all the answers, and we never will. And it allows us to step back from that a little bit and start trying to address the parts of it that we can understand and that we can see. So to talk a little bit more about that, I'm going to share my screen again. And the example I'm going to talk about is this balance that we often find between resilience and efficiency. So within a complicated system, efficiency and resilience can be quite connected. So if again, thinking about the bicycle, efficiency for a bicycle, is about, how much energy you're putting in versus how much you're getting out. And the resilience of that closed system is very much tied in to how efficient it is. But the problem is with complex systems, resilience and efficiency can often be in opposition to each other. And if we don't understand that, and if we treat a system that is complex as complicated, then it can create some real challenges for us and for our groups. So this image is an example, the just-in-time supply model that supermarkets tend to use is an example of efficiency. And it's trying to treat this system as complicated, but actually what we're seeing right now, in quite an unprecedented, maybe understanding it, or maybe supermarkets knew it was complex, but they wanted to present it as complicated, because no one really wants to be the one supermarket without stacked shelves or without the ability to get something, as cheap as possible. And this is one of the challenges of efficiency, is that as an individual or as a group, it's really hard for you to prioritize your own resilience when everyone else is focused on efficiency. Because if everybody else is focused on efficiency, whether that's financial efficiency or time or resources or anything like that, it's really hard to be the one that speaks up and says, actually, no, I think we should do things differently. There's a real challenge in that. As an example, and it might have been that some of you, similar example in your discussion, to a barrier within a group of poor communication can be to have more meetings or specific meetings, and sometimes that can work. But often, bringing in more meetings is a way of addressing something as though it's complicated. The challenge is complicated, so okay, well, we've got a tool here. It's another meeting. Let's throw that in. But often, what we find, and it's completely intuitive, is that actually the problem was complicated in the first place. It was complex, sorry. So we throw another meeting in, but actually people aren't prepared for that meeting. They don't feel so much more going on than just the case of whether or not there is a meeting or not. And so there is an example of we're treating something that's complex as though it's complicated, and the solution is not helping. And if anything, it can create more tension, more barriers, and make things more difficult. So this idea of efficiency being a counterpoint to resilience, I think, is really important, and one that can help us think about how we put resilience in place. And to talk a little bit more about that, the next talk about briefly is this the thought experiment of the prisoner's dilemma, which many of you might be familiar with, but just I'll explain very briefly. This is a thought experiment around game theory, which talks about two hypothetical prisoners who are both arrested, and they're given the opportunity to either confess to the crime or to remain silent. And they know that if they confess and the other person confesses, they both get 5 years. If they remain silent and the other person remains silent, then they get 1 year. But if they confess and the other person doesn't, they get to go free and the other person gets 20 years, and vice versa. So that's mapped out here. Just seen a comment in the chat sent to me. Sometimes my voice is dropping on and off. So yes, that is a technical issue. And if you miss anything, then do say, and I can recap, but hopefully it's coming through fine most of the time. So the reason I'm sharing this is because this talks a lot about efficiency. So in theory, the most efficient decision for anyone to make in the prisoner's dilemma is to act selfishly. That's in every situation, regardless of what the other person does. If you confess, then you will get the better outcome regardless of what the other person has chosen to do. So if you confess and the other person confesses, then you both get 5 years. And if you confess and the other person doesn't, you get to go free. And there's something in there around efficiency, and looking at this as quite a complicated thing. But the reality is the optimum scenario is that both people get 1 year and when they remain silent, but that requires a level of cooperation that efficiency often doesn't allow. And that comes from a lack of clarity of expectations. And this is a very, specific example. And this is not necessarily to say this is exactly what happens all of the time. But I think there's some really interesting questions in this exercise that talk to what happens when our expectations are not clear, and when we're taught to look at things through the eyes of efficiency rather than as resilience. And the key question for me here that this speaks to is, how do we prioritize resilience? And this is really the fundamental thing, above and beyond anything else, because whether it's personal resilience or group resilience, generally we understand that it is important. And generally we understand how to achieve it. Resilience is not rocket science. Where it falls down is how we actually enact these things, how we prioritize them. Because it's one thing knowing how to do it. And again, you could Google how to be resilient and you'll get thousands of answers and great suggestions for things you can do. But it's one thing to know them, and it's another thing to be able to put them into a complex system. That is the real challenge. And that's the thing that I want us to explore today. Because until we do that, all of the tips and tools and the ideas in the world are not going to help us. And how this is relevant, I think, with groups community groups, organizations, whatever, is thinking about the difference between clarity and trust and efficiency. So thinking about efficiency in terms of groups, this is often talked about as productivity. Okay, so groups are often talked about, how productive are they? Or if you think about teams, work teams, productivity is a really important aspect of that. It's a very often used measure. How productive are we? How efficient are we? And there's something about productivity that, I'm sure we've all experienced, of this real, this cult of productivity and this cult of busyness, and having to demonstrate how productive we are and how busy we are and how efficient we are. And we've kind of tricked ourselves into thinking that this is a complicated system, that this is something where if we are productive and if we are efficient, then we will win this game and we will find the solution and we will be okay. But actually, it's based on so much nuance and subjectivity and ambiguity. It's part of a complex system, but we don't see that. We don't look at it. So productivity, the idea that a 9 to 5, 5 day a week job is the most efficient way to do things is absolutely ludicrous. You know, it's completely made up. You think about, certainly in the UK, the idea of a working week. I mean, a weekend only came up because you know, factory workers were finding that employees were more likely to die by machine failures than if they didn't have a break than if they did. You know, and we think about the kind of historical context of where we get the systems we are in. And generally they're quite made up, but we treat them as though they are efficient and as though they make sense, because that's what everybody else does. And this is where collective resilience falls down in the face of collective efficiency. And productivity, this push to, you know, always be the one who's working late or trying harder or putting more energy in, or, you know, holding more meeting or answering, is very similar to the prisoner's dilemma, in that if we were able to collaborate and talk about this, we could recognize that the most resilient scenario is where there is collaboration. But actually we're so kind of pushed into ourselves and this idea that we have to be productive and we have to serve ourselves in that way, and that's the way forward, that we trick ourselves into this system that really doesn't serve where we want to be. Some really lovely comments in the chat box, and thank you for that. It's really great to hear people's different interpretations and reflections on this. I want to talk a little bit more about this, and then we'll have another small group discussions and give you a chance to discuss this amongst yourselves. But I want to talk about kind of what I feel to be the counterpoint to efficiency, which is this idea of clarity and trust. And for me, this is the cornerstone of resilience within groups. So thinking about productivity and thinking about, you know, the kind of demands that are put on ourselves by us and by our teams and by our colleagues or group members, and where these things often come from. You know, where does the lean towards efficiency or the lean towards productivity come from? And thinking about the roles that we have in groups. There's this is the kind of the line that I have drawn, that in theory, if you think the more clarity that we have in our groups, the less trust is required. And the more trust we have, the less clarity is required. Because if we have complete clarity over what we are supposed to be doing and how we work together and what the purpose of the group is, then we don't really need to trust each other, because that clarity and that shared understanding is there. And in the counterpoint to that is, if the clarity isn't there, if we have a group and it's not really clear about what we're trying to achieve or why we exist, then we fundamentally need a level of trust. We need that trust to be able to get through the uncertainty. Because if we trust that the other people have similar values, or we know who they are and we know where they're coming from, then the clarity is less important. What often happens in practice is you can have down in this area, there can sometimes be quite a perverse situation where the less clarity you have, the less trust you have, and actually you can often be in a job where you really don't know what you're supposed to be doing, or in a group where you really don't know what the point is, and there's also a real lack of trust about, you know, does someone just trust that you're going to get on with it? Do you trust that someone else is going to just, you know, make something happen? Whereas where we want to be really is in this top right hand corner, because that's the ideal scenario for any group, is that people trust each other to work in shared interests, and there is clarity about what that means. So what I want you to do, when I split you back into groups, is think about this graph. Think about this relationship between clarity and trust within your group, and think about where is that? Where is that for you? Is it somewhere along this middle line? Is it down in the bottom left? Is it up in the top right? Is it somewhere in between? But thinking about, you know, is it clear what is expected in this group? Is it clear what success looks like? And how does that level of trust work? Or are there patterns at play that push us towards these ideas of productivity, you know, and working all of the time? Because it's really important to recognize these patterns. This is just one example of a pattern that can happen in any kind of group, is this counterplay between clarity and trust. And with any pattern, and with any cycle, it can push us down. It can be negative, or it can be positive. And the more clarity and trust we have, the higher that goes. But also, if we start taking away clarity or start taking away trust, then it can spiral down in the opposite direction. So again, that might be that might not resonate for everybody. This is how I have experienced it in working with and in organizations. But if you interpret it in a different way, or find something else resonates, then really go with a language that works for you. But I'm going to put you back into your groups now for another 10 minutes, and this is the last time we'll be in these smaller groups, and just discuss that, how that resonates for you, and where you think your group is on that spectrum, and then I'll bring you back and we'll share some of that. So a couple more things I want to share on the screen. And this is a concept that is really relevant at the moment. I just want to talk to it briefly. This concept of liminal suspension. And what the liminal suspension is it talks to this idea of where change can happen. So when something changes and is kind of going from A to B, there's a period in between where new opportunities and ideas can emerge. At Eden Project, they talk about this concept in terms of snow permission, and use the analogy of when there's a big event. It changes the way people interact, the way they behave, and the way they see permission and opportunity. And you get things like people that would never happen, the kind of communication and collaboration that people don't feel like they have permission to do when things are quote unquote normal. And what we're experiencing now is a really good example of liminal suspension within this pandemic and the lockdown. We're seeing people are starting to recognize that tomorrow doesn't have to be the same as today. And when we're thinking about resilience, that's an incredibly powerful position to be in, because again, resilience is one of those words that we all recognize as being as important. But when you think that tomorrow is going to be the same as today, resilience doesn't really mean anything in practice, because resilience speaks to uncertainty and speaks to threat and danger and risk. But actually, if we're so used to the way things have always been, those things are just abstract concepts. But when we're in this place of liminal suspension or snow permission or whatever it might be, people start to imagine new ideas, and there's space for new things to be created. And anything can change, really, whether it's spaces, whether it's roles, whether it's relationships, things that are really hard. And the reason I'm sharing this is not to say that, we have to go to, the anarchy or shared governance is the only answer. I think sometimes that is the right option. But really, we do often need systems. We need shorthand to be able to communicate to each other, but we can't be consumed by their inflexibility. So when there are ways to demonstrate that flexibility and to act on it, that's what we need to be doing. So coming back to this question, it's really about collective resilience. So how do we prioritize resilience? We have to do it collectively. So within personal resilience, you need to understand how your own personal resilience is affected by the wider society. There's only so much you can do to be resilient personally, because you exist within systems that don't promote personal resilience. And so you have to accept what you can control and what you can't. And within groups, it's similar in that we really struggle to act independently. And I think the prisoner's dilemma really demonstrates that. We struggle to be collective and to collaborate when we don't have the shared language, or someone put in the chat the shared vision to do that. And a really good example of that is look at global carbon targets. Okay, so every country has got its own carbon targets of how much carbon it wants to reduce, and this, if you want to be fairly cynical, you can look at that as quite a good example of the prisoner's dilemma, in terms of no one country wants to move away from efficiency if other countries aren't doing the same. Like, no one country wants to put more money into cutting carbon than others, because the outcome, the benefit is shared, but the input is individual. And that's often the case in any kind of group dynamic. And if we can't act together, then we will automatically prioritize efficiency, because that's what we understand, that's what we know, and that's how these systems work. That's what we can recognize. So to move away from that and to be able to prioritize resilience, we need new language and new ways of collaborating with each other that give us permission to step away from efficiency. So the last exercise I want to go through together, which is before we kind of wrap up and we have an open discussion, is this, and this is an exercise I went through in the personal resilience workshop, but we're going to do it slightly differently, and it's called the resilience tree. Within personal resilience, this is a really great exercise to do, where you put the roots of your resilience, so what gives you resilience, at the bottom, and the fruits of what resilience gives you at the top. And it's a really good way of understanding patterns and developing new ones. But what I want to do is just play around with this in a slightly different way, and look at it in terms of group resilience. So thinking about what gives groups resilience, and what does resilience enable groups to do or to be. And I want to focus on the fruits initially. So thinking about, if your group is resilient, what does that enable your group to do or to be? So in the chat box, if you want to shout out, I just want to get 5 or 10 examples of this, and I'll jot them down, and then we can have a look at them. So no right or wrong answers, just think about within your groups or groups generally, what does resilience allow you to do? So making good decisions, great example. Get things done. Adaptability, great. Yeah. Ability, supporting each other. Apologies if I'm missing a couple as they go by. More productive, inclusive, great, yeah. Connection, teamwork, great, learn, and planning, great. These are excellent. So we could go on for years and years and years. Yeah, some excellent ones there. Focus on strengths, growth. Apologies for the ones I missed that went past. We could go on and we could add so many to this. But the principle of this exercise, it's just trying to get things down on paper in terms of what does resilience enable your group to do. And this is thinking about the idea of shared language. Because if you are going to try and improve the resilience of your group, it's not something you can do on your own. It has to happen collectively for all of the reasons we've gone through. And for all of these ideas around pulling away from efficiency for efficiency's sake, looking at clarity and trust. And a big part of this is identifying that shared language and the shared vision. So you've got, a really lovely group of words here, and similarly to when it's personal resilience for yourself, it's really useful then to think about, what do these things mean? What do they mean in practice? So you've identified some really lovely ideas, and maybe you think about, okay, so more productive. So more productive is a great example, and whatever your group is, probably that makes quite clear that it's, if you're biscuits, and if you're a community group that distributes meals to the community, maybe that means you're going to distribute more meals. So that's okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Some of these things, adaptability or connection, being inclusive. Again, these are really nice ideas, but they don't immediately mean anything in them themselves to your group. So if you're trying to find this shared language and this clarity and this trust, then we need to break these things down a bit more. What are these actually going to mean? Because, you look at a word like inclusive, which is such a powerful word and really, really important. But the danger is that if you start using words like inclusive and say that, you know, we need to be more inclusive, it's such a powerful and provocative word that if there isn't clarity about what that means, that can actually reduce trust. Because if one person thinks that someone else thinks that they think that they're not inclusive, or if you think that someone else has a different view of what that means, or that the answer is different, then because it's so important and so powerful and so loaded, it can actually push you further down into that kind of lack of clarity and lack of trust part of that spectrum. And so it can be really challenging. So just writing these things is often not enough. You need to break that down. So you put inclusive there, the roots of the resilience. So with personal resilience, it's often the other way around, in that the roots are easier and the fruits are harder. But within groups, it tends to be the opposite way. So thinking about the roots now. So what is it that gives you resilience? Again, in the chat box, or if you want to shout out and unmute yourself, give me some ideas of what are the things that create resilience in groups. If we've identified what resilience gives the group, what gives the group resilience in the section? Great example: transparency, knowledge. This is a great exercise in speed typing and trying not to make terrible typos. Safe place to work, excellent. Yep. What else? Recognizing skills, brilliant. Funding, yeah, that's a big one. Engagement, variation of outlook. Great, loads coming in now, so I'm going to miss some. Apologies there. Communication, empathy, lovely word there. Pulling in the same direction. Okay, so I'll leave that there. And again, if I've missed yours, it's not because I don't think it's right. My brain only works so fast. So some really lovely examples there of different things, different roots of resilience, so the things that give us resilience. And similarly to doing this at a personal level, it's really useful to look at these and think about, how do they sit? I did this last week. I've spelt knowledge wrong, which just feels so ironic. Anyway, knowledge as, you know, within an organization, what does that mean? Is it complicated or is it complex? You know, having a safe place to work, often that's treated as complicated, and it can be solved, and there are certain things you can do, but actually it's probably much more of a complex situation. It's much more based on where people are themselves, and it's not something that we can control. Communication, empathy, all of these ideas, engagement, funding, you know, maybe that's complicated rather than complex, and maybe that doesn't matter. But thinking about, how clear is it what these things mean in your organization, to be able to recognize skills. If you say that to one person, you know, you could say, okay, to a manager, we need to recognize skills, and they might do a skills audit, you know, and they might send out a spreadsheet and say, okay, everyone put their skills on this. But that's not necessarily a solution to the problem. And thinking about trust, and thinking about clarity, and thinking about what is that going to trigger in people, and how's that going to make people feel in terms of efficiency? Have I got time? Need to make it sound like I've got loads of skills, or do I want to make sure that it doesn't look like I have skills, so I'm not going to be asked to do anything when I don't have time to do it? And these things happen within a really complex system, but so often we treat them as individual complicated situations or scenarios. And that can be incredibly problematic. So a useful thing to do with this resilience tree is to think about, okay, well, how are these things connected as part of a system? And how do we prioritize them? Because I would argue putting together a skills audit spreadsheet for recognizing skills is not necessarily going to lead to anything. But if you look at it in a much more holistic way, we can then start, you know, drawing connections between, okay, well, in some ways, if we recognize our skills, maybe we will be able to understand how we can collectively speak to different groups and different demographics and be more inclusive, or be more connected. And it's really thinking about, how do these things work together? How are they patterns? How are they connected? And making sure we don't treat them all in isolation. And this is a really, really quick whistle stop way through here. And I'd really love to do this more collaboratively and more openly. And I would really recommend you do it in your own time. But this exercise is all about recognizing patterns and trying to create new ones. And that really is the essence of group resilience. What are the patterns that are happening? And sometimes they are going to be complicated. And I hope what I've said here hasn't made anyone think, oh my God, I can never ever view anything as just a complicated problem ever again, because that's not the case. You know, sometimes a bicycle is just a bicycle, but often there are going to be situations where we need to look at things bigger, and we can't do that on our own. We need to work collectively. We need the right language, the right tools, the right resources, and the right perspectives to be able to do that. And these ideas around efficiency, around clarity and trust, and around how we prioritize resilience and recognize those patterns, certainly in what I've seen, are the best tools we have to go and do that. So, you know, by all means, you know, pay for consultants to come in and help you be more resilient, or find lists of the top 10 things you can do to be more resilient in your organization. And those things can definitely help. But at a fundamental level, I really think what we need to do is understand, what are the patterns that are happening in our groups? Are they taking us down? Are they building us up? How do we recognize them, and how do we change them? Because until we do that, we're really only going to treat them as complicated problems, and they're only going to go so far. And we need that collective perspective to be able to be resilient and be able to look at things as the complex challenges they are. So that's everything I wanted to go through. And I've realized I've only left about 3 minutes for discussion. So apologies for that. Again, really happy to have follow-up meetings for this, and we can chat with Eden about that. But I'm very happy to stay on for a little bit longer. There's some really interesting things in the chat about change and about systems thinking that, you know, be amazing to get into in a bit more detail. So we could definitely have a follow-up to look at some of these specific things. But I'm going to shut up there. I'm going to pass back to Lucy, and then I'm very happy to stick around to have a bit more of an open discussion with people for whoever wants to stay around. But yeah, that's enough for me. So thank you.